Dr. Scott Masson here with Paideia today and my colleague Dr. Bill Friesen. Today we are going to look at Geoffrey Chaucer, the first great writer in the English language, often accounted the greatest early poet, buried, I believe, in Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey, the first such buried there. Man that I greatly admired as an undergraduate and wanted to study and didn't for a wide variety of reasons, which I don't think I'll probably get into here. But so I'm not the resident medievalist here, Dr. Friesen is. And tell us something about Chaucer himself, Bill, because he himself is an extraordinarily interesting fellow. It's not just his poetry, he is really interesting.
Yeah, he's got a very rich background, and of course, our understanding of his biography is limited. Like many medievalists, he was not really that much at pains to promote his own personality. He was more interested in his work rather than his work as an extension of himself. And he was born at a pivotal time in medieval history, a very interesting time. We know that he was born sometime in the 1340s. Exactly when, we don't know. But of course, for anybody who knows their history, as soon as I start talking about the 1340s in England, their mind might fire up a flare and say, wait, didn't the Black Plague strike England in the 1340s? Yes, it did, 1348. The plague came to England. And so Chaucer was a child when the plague swept through, and it is estimated, well, the estimates are all over the place. We don't have accurate figures as to the death toll of the Black Plague. I've heard anything between 15 to up to 25% of the population of England died during the Black Plague, which is obviously a ghoulish sort of historical development, but on the other hand, it had a backhanded benefit to Chaucer and his family. Chaucer's father was a land-owning wine merchant. For those of you who know about these sorts of things, you will know that England, your average medieval, drank a very considerable amount of beer on any given day. And this includes the children, this includes the old, this is men and women, because of course beer is something which is safe to drink, having gone through the fermentation process, having alcohol in it. Your average Englishman would be drinking a lot of beer in the day. But this, having said that, this is something known as small beer, usually spelled S-M-A-L, one L. So it's relatively weak beer, but it's still alcoholic. But on the other hand, wine was seen very much as a luxury good. And so Chaucer's immediately surrounded as he's growing up by a world of comparative luxury. Now, this has a further effect on the response to the Black Plague, because the plague actually opened up a lot of land, opened up a lot of work and merchant opportunities. And apparently Chaucer's father took advantage of this. And so he managed to grow his fortunes considerably, and he was in a position to give his son a lot of advantages that probably otherwise would not have materialized. He sent young Geoffrey off as a page to the Count of the Countess of Ulster when he was young. So in addition to growing up surrounded by a relatively luxurious upbringing, he's also moving in circles at a young age and being educated amongst a very learned crowd, amongst a very cultured crowd. He's in a strong position to network, and from what little we can tell, Chaucer turned out to be pretty good at networking when he wanted to be. So he was well placed in all of these. So predictably, his star rose quite rapidly. We know that from the moving from the court to the Countess of Ulster, he very quickly made his way into the service of Prince Lionel, who is the son of King Edward III. So Chaucer's moving right up into the upper ranks of society. We know that a lot of people because a lot of people only know of Chaucer, if at all, through the Canterbury Tales. A lot of people have the impression that he's a rather jovial, humorous, light-hearted individual. But for anybody who's actually studied his work, and you've studied it very extensively,
At one point.
You will know, of course, that the man is also incredibly complex, and has a capacity to be something other than a comedian when he wants to.
So he translates the Consolation of Philosophy, for instance, which is extraordinary, and a work on suffering and, the meaning of evil. It's a treatise on this, so it really does contradict the general impression of the jovial bonhomme that you're presenting there. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, some people have portrayed him in movies as kind of a peripheral character. The Knight's Tale, I think, has him as kind
Yeah.
of a scoundrel who's quick to wine and women and jokes and stuff like this, which of course is the general impression that popular culture has of Chaucer. But no, he's actually a very different individual. He can put on and do so extremely successfully, but he can do other things as well, as you point out. We know that he saw service in France during the 100 Years' War.
Yeah.
As a man who has actually seen violence up close and personal, but he doesn't tell us much about that, hardly anything in point of fact. We also know that he was a language guy, and
Yes.
you've already alluded to this here with the translation of the Consolation of Philosophy. We know that he was also fluent in it in French, and this served him very well indeed. He worked in a capacity, what we might describe nowadays as something of a diplomat as well, and traveled and extensively represented on that front. And it was in that time that he came into contact with this shifting culture in southern France and northern Italy, which we've already talked about around Dante and Chaucer's over there.
Well,
And
he met Petrarch and Boccaccio, I understand, while he was in Italy, right? So roughly,
yes, exactly.
yeah, the same era.
Yeah, so he's heavily influenced by and engages with many of the really exciting ideas that these thinkers, the Italian Renaissance thinkers, are bouncing around. And he takes them in, and like a typical Englishman, one of the things, if you know anything about English literature, is that the English are great adapters. In some senses, they're similar to the Romans in that sense. They take things from the outside and then they bring them to England, but then they make them thoroughly English in and of themselves.
Yeah.
And Chaucer is one of these pioneering figures who actually did that. So one of the ideas that Chaucer picks up from Petrarch and brings back to England is this notion of writing great works of literature in the local language. So you're not writing great works of literature, yeah. It's the vernacular. And Petrarch writes a treatise called De Vulgaria, in which he espouses the virtues of writing in your local language as an expression of your culture and things of this nature here. And Chaucer takes that very seriously. And for this reason...
as did Dante, right?
As did Dante as well, and indeed as did Boccaccio in the Decameron. And so he's one of these real pioneering figures when it comes to writing literature in what we now would call English. Of course, Chaucer is writing in Middle English. He's not writing in Shakespearean English. That's later. But he begins to experiment with adapting meter to the English language. And he's the first great pioneer of iambic pentameter.
Yep.
And he is sometimes disparaged as such for doing so, because a lot of people during the Renaissance did not actually know properly how to read Middle English, and they thought that some of the syllables which were actually articulated were actually silent, and so on and so forth. So they said they would oftentimes say things like Chaucer's iambic pentameter is hypermetrical or something of this nature.
Right.
When in point of fact, it was not.
No, his English is more like German, the every syllable pronounced, that sort of thing, right?
Yes, if you're reading Middle English, you broaden out your vowels, especially to continental pronunciations. And yes, every vowel is articulated. So if you got the word weak spelled Middle English, W-E-A-K-E, it's weeka.
Yeah.
And you have to pronounce the whole thing. So he's also messing about with what we now take for granted by way of meter, which is accentual meter. If you know anything about French, and more particularly Italian and Spanish, you know that the meter is arranged according to syllable length rather than stress. Chaucer realizes that that's not going to make any sense to the English language, so he adapts and he really begins fiddling with accentual meter. And there are quite a number of good studies out there of the pioneering work that Chaucer has done. And he was so influential on these fronts in adapting the English language to literature and specifically to poetry, that later Renaissance writers like George Puttenham called him the father of English poetry. You already alluded to this to some extent here.
Yep.
And historically speaking, maybe he's not the father of English literature, but nevertheless, it was on the development of English literature in later centuries, which is enormous. Another thing that popularized Chaucer's work and his endeavors, his ambitions, was the fact that when Caxton brought the first printing press to London in 1473, the first thing printed was the Bible, but the second thing that he printed was Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And so the Canterbury Tales became enormously popular, available. The printing press obviously is giving you something that medievals could not take for granted, which was perfectly accurate for the most part. And it was cheap, incredibly cheap. And this meant that not just the upper classes, but also the middle classes and sometimes even the lower classes had access to the Canterbury Tales. So there's an explosion of popularity of Geoffrey Chaucer in the Renaissance. But this is also a little bit misleading, because Chaucer never saw the Canterbury Tales as as being his great work. The thing that he thought was going to sort of secure him literary greatness is a different text here. I've got one of it, and it is just this text here, Troilus and Cressida.
Yeah, the one that I wrote on. Oh, yeah.
Yes, and sadly, a lot of people have not read this work. Chaucer considered this his greatest work, and the Canterbury Tales was something, to a large extent, that he wrote in order to entertain his friends and, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't the core of where he thought his fame would lie. Just as the core of Shakespeare's fame, Shakespeare thought wasn't going to reside in his plays, which we read nowadays, of course, but his sonnets, his great sonnet cycle that he wrote. So we got all of that in front of us there. What else do we want to say about Chaucer?
And if you want to nod in the same direction, interestingly, Shakespeare, now that you mention it, has a play called Troilus and Cressida on those same two figures, who, just for the reader's information, because you wouldn't really know otherwise, are peripheral figures mentioned in the Iliad on either side of the Trojan wall, one being Greek and the other being Trojan. So it's like in the account of the Iliad, it's almost you read over and they're not there, it's gone, but they become significant in Chaucer's rendering, and so influential that Shakespeare decides to write a play on the two. So that's interesting in itself.
Yeah, Chaucer's influence on the Renaissance, and of course writers thereafter, is immediate and quite profound, more so than a lot of people realize. He's also somebody who lives quite a successful life on sort of material scale. We're going to be looking at later writers who struggled in the pragmatic concerns of their life as they come up, but this is not Chaucer. Chaucer is successful as a writer, as a diplomat, various courts, and he becomes the controller of textiles in the latter part of his life. And that is something that's a role which is actually a lot more important than a lot of people might think at first glance, because England is in a bit of an economic revolution towards the end of the High Middle Ages. And textiles is one of these boom markets. In fact, it is the boom market. And it is powering, of course, large elements of the Renaissance in the Low Countries, in France and in Italy. And England is taking off on this front as well. And of course, the vast bulk of those textiles coming in and going out are going out through the port of London. And who controls that trade? Chaucer does. So I held that role for 12 years in point of. So that's a little bit about the man himself. I don't want to say too much on these fronts here because a lot is left to speculation, and I don't want to speculate
So
too
he's a
much.
member of the royal family. He has his own coat of arms. He's loosely linked with them. So I mean, he's an aristocrat himself, right?
He is a full-blown aristocrat. He's not one of these sort of peripheral figures. He is definitely in and in deep. And again, a lot of people don't seem to make that connection. They think he's kind of an earthy, kind of everyman kind of a guy, because of their contact with the Canterbury
Canterbury
Tales
Tales.
and the content of the Canterbury Tales and the style of the tales. So,
So
yeah,
we were,
perhaps we should.
yeah, sorry. We were going to look at the Canterbury Tales, and we weren't quite sure what we were going to look at. There are so many different ones, and they're quite many of them are very entertaining, and all of them are worth study. We thought about the Wife of Bath's Tale, which is notorious and extremely funny, of course. But I think we've settled on the Pardoner's Tale, Bill. And for me, it was interesting. I mean, I don't have a lot to say about this. I'm going to leave you to speak to it because you're the expert on it. And for me, it's a distant memory, the Pardoner's Tale. But it is related to a practice which the Reformation makes famous, insofar as it's dealing with a man who sells indulgences, and furthermore is quite open about his corruption, his simony. Dante would have him in hell for this, but he is open in his and flagrant in his activities here. And this is, remember, this is what, in the late 14th century, so 1300. This is hundreds of years before the Reformation, and yet there's it's being openly flooded. There's a problem with the selling of indulgences, etc. here. So that in itself is interesting. But you tell me a bit about the play, about the tale and the telling thereof.
Yeah, I'm going to come back and talk about that. The Canterbury Tales, I'm just going to say very briefly.
In general, okay, good.
It's very difficult to actually choose just one target when it comes to the Canterbury Tales, because as you say, you know, the Wife of Bath's Tale is a fascinating and rollicking tale with many, many complexities to it. The Miller's Tale, scandalous as it is and risque as it is nevertheless a fabulous read, and its tale has lots of interesting things to say about it. We could go on about these, but you've got to, at the end of the day, we can't say everything about everything, so we're just going to limit ourselves to the Pardoner's Tale. The Canterbury Tales themselves were intended initially by Chaucer. Each pilgrim on their way to Canterbury was supposed to tell 2 tales going there and 2 tales coming back. Of course, that would have given us 120 tales, all told, by the time we get to the end. In point of fact, there are only 24 tales that ever get written. And if you know anything about Chaucer, and if you've read some of his other works, you'll know that he oftentimes plans very ambitiously as a writer and then falls well short of the quantitative mark that he's aimed at. So he's done that elsewhere, and he does it here with the Canterbury Tales as well. So we've only got about approximately 24. By the year 1400, they're circulating in handwritten manuscript forms amongst his friends and what have you. That's largely what has survived down to us. You mentioned also Indulgences, and I want to talk about that briefly as well, and the curious attitudes towards the church that seem to be displayed in the Canterbury Tales. It is true, you're absolutely on that, your average medieval looked upon the church with a capital C rather askance at this period in history. Many people had their reservations about the institutional church at the highest levels and the practices that were going on in reality. And they also seem to have had occasionally, depending on which historical evidence we're looking at, a fair degree of skepticism about the virtues of individual churchmen that they were meeting in real life. However, I think a lot of readers who read stories like The Pardoner's Tale and things like that get the sense that there was an overwhelming cynicism by your average medieval towards the church and your average Englishman towards the church. And actual evidence doesn't point that out. In reality, it seems that many Englishmen were willing to take the churchmen themselves on a person-to-person basis. We have to remember that the pardoner is a caricature. He is not, this is not meant to be a real life portrait, comedic or otherwise, of this individual. So his salient features, especially in terms of comportment, behavior, even appearance, are exaggerated for comedic effect. I don't think many writers have been better at caricature than Geoffrey Chaucer. Possible exceptions, Charles Dickens, I
I was going
suppose.
to say those two are the obvious candidates. Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's a possibility that your average credulous English student is going to read the Canterbury Tales, read a character like the partner, and assume that that's basically how your average medieval saw your average churchman.
Yeah.
But let's talk a little bit about indulgences, because again, a lot of people also have a problematic understanding of just what an indulgence was at this point in history. And the definition here, the partner is granting something called papal indulgences. And what those do is they reprieve you from earthly punishments and penance after the believer had confessed and been absolved by a priest. So a lot of people think that you just buy them and it's kind of like a get out of sin jail free card. It's not that. Because a lot of times you would be assigned penance and punishments and what have you for the bad things that you had done. These would allow you to get off the hook. And you could get them for a quote unquote charitable donation to the church, i.e. you're paying for them. And obviously you've got an entire sketchy subculture in medieval Europe at this, which is forging and selling indulgences all over the place. So some of them definitely were real indulgences, but a lot of them were just forgeries. From the sounds of it, that's what this partner here in this tale is peddling. Forged everything, whether they're relics or indulgences or what have you.
So a contemporary equivalent would be if you were assigned jail for some crime, but in lieu of jail time, you could give a certain amount of money or of community service. So, but in this case, it would be the money, and the money would go to the Pope.
Yes, which is important for a number of reasons we don't have time to get into, because of course now you're filtering money directly to Rome rather than to the local churches. We need to make distinctions also between monastic orders and priestly orders in England at this time, and so it's a very complicated situation. Interesting but complicated. Anyway, so we've zeroed to see on the partner's tale, and he's a very curious figure, and he's what else should we say about him at the front end here? Oh yeah, let me make one more qualification about medieval, and we're going to see this also with Renaissance, and then strangely and especially with 18th century literature. There tends to be a lot of humor in this text, or in these texts, which is, it falls under the heading of sort of buffoonery, slapstick, a lot of crazy, wild hijinks happen. And because that's done so dramatically, a lot of people are also missing the fact that this is not just kind of buffoonery and sort of juvenalian comedy and stuff of that nature. There's a lot of wit. There's a lot of sort of carefully modulated taste going into the humor, and indeed the overall artistry of the text. And I think a lot of people, because they think they're reading a comedic text, sort of turn off some of the careful, close reading apparatus in their brain and don't see the actual art of these tales. These tales are extremely complex and oftentimes very well wrought. They make a lot of allusions to the Canterbury Tales too lightly. What more do I want to say on that front here?
I just want to say, Bill, this is this is breaking up constantly. This is the recording is really terrible.
Yeah, it's froze there for a little bit as well.
Yeah.
So hopefully Wes can edit us out of this jungle of confusion. How much of what I said did you just catch?
Some. I mean, a fair bit. It's just that I don't know if it can be recovered so that it's coherent, or whether he just has to hack it out. I really don't know. Even now you're freezing up. Yeah.
Well, all we can do is soldier on here, I suppose.
Yep.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Pardoner's Tale. Let me just give you the first few lines of the Pardoner's prologue. This is not the tale itself. So you have to remember the Canterbury Tales, it has an overall prologue, which if you're going to read individual tales, you should read the overall prologue.
The general prologue, yeah.
Then, yes, and then each individual tale has a prologue as well. So you should read that as well. Both of those give you a double context for the reading of the tale itself. So I'm reading to you from the Pardoner's prologue. It says, this is obviously translated into modern English. My lords, he said, in churches when I preach, I take great pains to have a haughty speech, and ring it out as roundly as a bell. I know it all by heart, what I've to tell. My theme's always the same and ever was, radix malorum est cupiditas, which is to say that greed is the root of all evil. And so begins a pattern with the Pardoner. He is basically what he's doing by telling you this prologue. He's telling you what he does and how he does it. That he is a sketchy individual who fleeces people of their money by trickery and by, above all, by telling sermons, but sermons which are told like stories. And so he is a storyteller, and he uses storytelling to do iniquitous stuff to get the money of people who are ignorant.
So there's a contemporary phrase, and I'm not sure it's entirely accurate here, but it's gaslighting, and he's talking about, you know, greed being the root of all evil, while portraying a tale of greed and announcing to them effectively that he's a greedy, manipulative person, and they don't seem to. They seem to be they don't seem to be too disturbed by the whole process, as if he's managed to hoodwink them.
You have to think of this a little bit. Imagine yourself in a position where a con man comes to you and says to you, hi, I'm a con man. This is how I do my con man work. This is how I trick people and get their money and steal stuff, quite frankly. What would your response to such an admission be? Do you feel ironically honored that he trusted to tell you this, safe all of a sudden? Because obviously if he's telling you that he's a con man, he's not going to try to con you, is he? Of course, that's exactly what's going to happen here. What exactly is his objective in being this upfront with these people? He's telling them point blank, effectively, I steal money, and this is how I do it.
Well, he's on a pilgrimage to Canterbury, though. He's going to confess those sins. Maybe that's a sort of public confession.
This has been one of my working theories for many years, that there's some kind of extremely complex confessional sub-narrative going on in this text. My position on that falls well short of certainty. But there definitely seems to be some kind of confession going on, to be sure. But while he's doing that, we also, at the same time, it doesn't sound like he's going to repent of his evils. So he'll admit his evil, but he won't say he's sorry. And he's certainly not going to resolve not to do these sorts of things in the future. No, quite the contrary. He's going to lean into it. So by any sort of theological model, his confession is rather pointless. And also remember, what does he sell? Indulgences, which of course is what you need after you confess.
And also he is the partner. He's the one who does the pardoning.
Yes. So immediately, as soon as you get into the Pardoner's Tale, it becomes incredibly complicated. What the heck is going on with this person? We also have to notice where he is in the cavalcade. He rides at the back. He is, and trust me, where you ride means something in the Middle Ages. And he is not up at the front end. You might think of riding at the back of a convoy like this as the teenagers who sit at the back of the class. We know who those guys are. Amongst whom I may include myself.
I had to look away myself, so there you
go. My own confessional moment. He's at the back, and remember, appearance matters in your inner character. And nowadays we're so quick to say, well, you mustn't judge somebody merely on their appearances. And fair enough in certain senses. But when it comes to medieval literature and painting a character portrait, your external appearance is going to matter. And so we have a number of rather graphic observations made of the partner. We have to note, first of all, his hair. His hair is lank and plastered to his head. It is gross and oily and long. And it is not blonde, it is yellow. Chaucer doesn't miss on details like this. So he's literally an unctuous, oily man. That's what he is.
Yeah.
And that's his character. He also has a high warbling voice. And I believe that the narrator at one point says, almost as if he were a gelding, which is going to be important. So his sexuality is immediately suspect. He is a skinny, oily, high-voiced individual riding in the most unrespected position in the cavalcade. And what is his behavior like as he begins telling his tale? It all follows perfectly in line with his actual physical appearance. So just by looking at him, you know you've got trouble from this guy. And he comes right out at the beginning and he tells you as much. He says, yep, trouble is exactly what I do for a living. And the host, of course, from the previous tale is distraught. He's snarling and cursing and he's all upset because the previous tale, prior to the partners, has been a very sad tale. And so he wants a happy tale to cheer him up. And the partner giving you what you want or what you think you want. And he says, absolutely, let's do that. But then somebody else says, oh, but I want a moral tale. And without missing a beat, he says, yes, absolutely, I'll tell you a moral tale. Well, which one is it here? And it turns out he gives you something which is neither happy nor moral, really, at the end of the day. But he pretends to tell a moral tale. But immediately you see in catering to his audience, the fundamental dishonesty of the man. He will just give the audience whatever it is they think they want. And he just shifts and he shifts. He stands for nothing, which of course is one of his great challenges in life. Yeah, let's leave that there for the time being. Did you want?
Well, just a comment, but I don't think well, I mean, in this same era where we have Niccolo Machiavelli, right, writing his work, The Prince, and the characteristic portrait or the recommendation for a politician to appear to be moral, but to eschew morality in order to attain his ends. If you want to be a good politician, then whatever you do, don't do the moral thing, do the practical thing, which of course in Shakespeare's eyes is an abominable thing. I'm wondering whether this man is portrayed as a sort of a Machiavellian sort, but I'm not sure about that. And he's not a politician either, but he seems to speak of morality and have no understanding of it.
Yeah, it's the ending of this story here. I mean, you could write the partner off quite easily in terms of character if the ending of the story had followed the predictable pattern, but it doesn't. And I think there's quite a number of medieval tales, especially high medieval tales, where we think we know where the story is going, and more particularly, we think we've got a read on the characters, and then strange things happen at the end of the story, and there's kind of a if you will, to use a modern analogy, the lens zooms back and your panorama widens, and all of a sudden you realize, no, this is part of a much bigger picture. We saw that with Sir Gawain in The Green Knight, where you had the tragic rise in the figure of Gawain. You had the same sort of thing happen with Sir Bersilac. But I could give you many examples where this is what happens towards the end of the tale. And in a weird, very clever, very original, very perhaps ironic and counterintuitive way, this is the same thing, I think. The partner kind of rises, but he doesn't really rise. I mean, he's still a bad man at the end of this story. But he's a bad man who may be coming to grips with his own badness, if you like. And it all turns to me on this question of, why are you telling everybody that you're a cheat, and you cheat by telling stories? I don't know what that says about Chaucer and Chaucer's attitude towards himself, and then turning around your audience at the end of this tale here as well. Why would you do that? He just about ends up getting gelded for real at the end of the story. But in any event, what is the partner's motivation? This is an overwhelming question in this story that we have to ask, and there are no clear answers to that, but it's still a very interesting question, I think. Shall we talk a little bit about the story itself?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the story. We encounter a lot of typical medieval machinery in here. We encounter the personified vices, which is a very common sort of a tactic. So we encounter gluttony, we encounter drunkenness, we encounter swearing, we encounter gambling. All these sorts of things crop up in the story. The story is of a bunch of, well, three guys in particular, who are partying hard.
And they're drunk. Yeah, they are drunk.
Yes, they are known oftentimes either as the revelers or the rioters. I've heard both names applied to them. And they are wildly foolish individuals, also, who are drunk, as you say. And they discovered that one of their friends has been killed, and he's been killed by death with a capital D, more personification.
Death has killed them. Yep.
Yes, and they swear vengeance. They're going to get death. And they out into the road, drunk out of their minds, looking to wreak mayhem, looking to find death, and this brings, and of course it's funny at the front end. Obviously, it's ridiculous. But
let's go get them.
Yes, but here notice another interesting thing that's happening at the meta narrative level. And we do have to talk about the meta narrative in the Partner's Tale, and indeed with many of Chaucer's tales. I know there's quite a number of modern teachers and professors who are rather addicted to meta narrative. So I usually kind of steer a little bit around that. But here I don't think we can get away from it. They are unable to read the figure of death figuratively. They read him literally. And because they interpret what they're told literally rather than figuratively, they're literally killed. And of course, as soon as we realize that we're reading, now we've got another audience. So you have the audience of the rioters who are told a tale that death has killed their friend. So there's audience set one and story one. And that story is being told by the partner who's telling his story about these guys being told a story. But of course, it doesn't end there. It's us sitting there reading Chaucer's Canterbury Tales about a guy who's telling a story about guys who are told a story. And one of the complaints that I hear oftentimes from my students is that Chaucer is so addicted to frame stories or frame narratives that with this story in particular, it's hard to know where the frames end and the actual story begins, or painting, if you want to follow that analogy. And I've even had a few students who suggested that there's no story really at all. There's just a series of concentric frame within frame within frame within frame, and it all leads ultimately for the writers to death. Anyway, so the question is whether or not they're able to read figuratively and whether or not they are going to suspend their disbelief when it comes to their understanding of these stories and what have you. So in the road, they meet a figure who is much talked about. Harold Bloom, in particular, likes talking about this figure.
The old man, yeah.
Yes, and nobody knows exactly.
What does Bloom make of him? Is he the wandering Jew for Bloom? Is he?
That is exactly what he says he is. And we'll come back and talk about that in just a second. But they meet an old man, and they ask the old man rather aggressively, "We're looking for death. Where is death?" And he says, "Oh, no problem. He's back over there under that tree." And so
it's an oak tree.
Yes. And again, because they can't read figuratively, they run to the tree and they find a treasure there. And they think, oh, there's no death here. There's only this treasure. Not really realizing that figuratively, the treasure will be their death. And yeah, we should talk a little bit about the old man and just who he is. The Wandering Jew. Do you want to say something about that?
Why? That's in John's Gospel, Jesus says, I believe of John, the disciple whom he loves, what to carry you if this man doesn't die, something like that. And so there's this mythology that arises that this man did not die and still wanders the earth, etc. And then what gets accrued to that becomes all sorts of things. But that's basically the origin of it, is that passage in John's Gospel, and the cryptic allusion to a man who may not die, and what's it to you if he doesn't? That's
Yes.
it, more or less, right?
That is it, more or less, correct.
Except that wandering Jew, this is the thing I always find puzzling about it, is a Christian. So why he should be, designated a wandering Jew seems rather odd to me.
Yeah, the whole thing's obviously apocryphal, and it's not carefully regulated by, logic. It doesn't make a lot of sense. And in my humble opinion, I'm not sure Bloom's argument is terribly convincing that this is indeed the wandering Jew. Is the figure the actual figure of death? I've heard that theory as well. Or is it just an old man in the road? But if so, how does he know about treasure and the fact that these guys will kill themselves in the pursuit of the treasure? But in any event, they discover the treasure. They don't understand that figuratively the treasure is their death. They're very happy. They're going to divide it 3 ways, nudge, wink, wink. And they send the youngest into town to buy to get more food and wine, because obviously they haven't drunk enough yet. And then they plot, as he's gone, they plot to murder him and take his portion of the treasure.
Yeah.
Realizing that the young guy has actually poisoned the food and wine that he brings back to them.
Because he got ahead of them on the front. Yeah.
That's right. So they murder him, and then they happily and confidently eat the bread and drink the wine and die. And there you are. Death has indeed found them under the tree. And
they found their treasure, their great reward.
Yes. Exactly. So that's the tale in a nutshell.
And then, at the end, the partner says, sort of inveighing against the vices of gluttony and gambling, blasphemy, etc., says that he'll be happy to give them divine forgiveness if they pay the price. That's how he concludes it, right? So it's extraordinary.
Yeah, so the con man is basically opening up the con, or trying
almost
to
shameless.
Told them that he's a con man, and he's running a con, and he cons by telling stories, and has just told a story. And now he's going to ask them again to basically accept the con. And obviously, some of the pilgrims lose it on him. One of them threatens to castrate him with his dagger, which of course might be sort of an apanellipsis back to the initial mention that, you know, he's got the voice of a gelding. Well, he's about to become a gelding for real, if that's indeed possible. So we have that a little bit there, but luckily others intercede, calm him down, and we come to an end of it. Question: why would he do this? And this is a question I've been asking for 20 years, and I still don't have an answer to it. Your thoughts on this?
I have no idea either. I mean, it could be just a way of getting under their, I mean, maybe he just can't help himself. Some people who are habitual liars, habitual thieves are quite open about it, and they can't help but be open about it because it becomes so much a part of their identity, but they're not particularly good at their thievery in the sense that it happens quite openly at that point. But that doesn't make any sense to me. It seems to me some sort of, I mean, he's on the road to Canterbury, right? They're on the road to some sort of religious act whereby they will be confessed, and this man's a pardoner, so he is going to get pardoned, and this is why he needs it. So it's some sort of weird sort of public confessional, but the man is an addict to what he does.
Yeah, he's caught out for trying to con them, but of course he makes himself wide open in terms of, you know, being caught.
But he tells them that he's a con man. So he's not trying to. You don't tell people that you're a con man when you're trying to con them, and it's so and at the end he concludes with, "If you give me some money," so that it's not going to work, right? But he can't help himself, so it's almost like yeah.
I've heard one person try to explain it away by saying he is so supremely confident, indeed overconfident, that he thinks that even after having made it easy for them to catch him and spot his shenanigans, he nevertheless thinks that this is a worthy challenge and he's going to get away with it again, even after he's warned them that he's a con man who's after their money.
I actually think there's something to it.
I'm not sure I buy.
I think there's something to it, because I think that there is an element of narcissism that accompanies such characters, and they, to some degree, become less and less aware of how transparent they are, and maybe Chaucer is talking about this sort of degeneration of someone who was once probably entirely plausible, but in the end is not. I don't know.
Yeah. We've got other things in play here as well. We have to remember that the partner may be operating in he is operating in a theological world which we would now call anachronistically Catholic, and with many Catholic models of theology, of course, your salvation is potentially a losable thing, if indeed you ever had it. One is to work out one's salvation with fear and trembling and all these sorts of things.
Mm-hmm.
And we have also the analogy, you know, many will come to me and say, Lord, Lord, and he'll say, I knew you not. So
Mm-hmm.
this is part of, you know, they're very complicated understanding of sin and eschatology and all the things that factor into that as well. Does the partner think that he has lost his salvation? And if so, is it even recoverable? Why is he going to Canterbury, as you say? What explains that? You know, is he just looking for a bunch of pilgrims to fleece? One feels that all those sorts of explanations are somehow maybe a little bit facile. Maybe there's something else going on here. I don't know. But that's my quick take on the partner and the partner's tale.
It's a fascinating story, and the fact that it comes in the sequence that it does, and that he is who he is, and the fact that it is related to the selling of indulgences obviously piques the curiosity of an English-speaking audience, with its, I guess, what becomes an anti-Catholic reading of the selling of indulgences and so forth, and seems to justify it. But it doesn't seem like Chaucer is particularly concerned with that even in this. So he's not condemning the partner either per se. It's not, it's not a proto-Protestant take on the selling of indulgences either. This is just an individual who happens to be a partner, and as you say, he's a type rather than, it's not going after the church per se, even doesn't even have a religious impulse.
A lot of people like to read this tale like that, and the tale itself doesn't support that kind of a reading. This is a send-up of the man, albeit he's a caricature and a type, but nevertheless it's a send-up of the man. And also we have to be a little bit careful about where we situate ourselves in this story as the audience, because the inner audience here are who are told the tale of death and the narratives, and of course they buy into that and they die because of it. Then we have the internal audience of the pilgrims listening to the tale about these guys who were told this story. And the partner tries to dupe them as well, but of course they reject that, predictably. But then of course we're also the audience of Chaucer. So are we, in some senses, insofar as we're the audience for Chaucer, are we in some senses Chaucer's mark? Are we in some senses being misled and manipulated and what have you? Where do we fit in to this entire sort of dynamic? I don't know.
And complicating the last question is, who did he think his audience was going to be? It's certainly not, he didn't realize that Caxton was going to spread his tracts around the country and make him a popular writer. He's writing for his friends. So is he really expecting his friends to be duped by this? No, he's not. I think it's more John Donne type writing to his buddies, and there's a nudge, nudge, wink, wink, and there's an element of humor, and you know that there are certain types that are corrupt who present themselves as clergymen, and yes, there are such types, and we don't need to reform the church. It's not a call for reformation. It's nothing like that. It's just the awareness that there are always Elmer Gantries in the church.
Yes. Good. Excellent. Okay. Unfortunately, I think we probably have to move on to the partner's tale at this point here. Scott, what are we going to be looking at in our next podcast?
Well, since we mentioned him already, let's talk about Mr. Shakespeare. And I think we discussed the possibility of Hamlet, but we could visit other plays as well. But why not? Let's do Hamlet. That quixotic play. You mentioned Bloom as well, and what he thinks of Hamlet. Well, who cares what Bloom thinks of Hamlet? But we will do that next time, and that looks like an exciting thing to do. But that concludes this episode, right?
Excellent. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time and listening to Paideia today. I am Dr. Bill Friesen, and I am joined here by my colleague, Dr. Scott Masson, and we will see you, hear you, listen, or you will listen to us on the next podcast.
Thank you.
Bye.